Everything has to be paid for. Between 2015 and 2020, Germany spent over $20 billion on the reception, housing, healthcare, education, and integration of Syrian refugees. That is not a humanitarian statistic, it is a budget line item. It is taxpayer money redirected from domestic infrastructure, defense, and social programs into the management of a crisis generated by a conflict Germany did not start and could not control. Meanwhile, Syria itself lost an estimated 30% of its pre-war GDP, not from bombs alone, but from the systematic departure of its workforce. Both ends of this equation are measurable, both ends are paid for. This episode examines how refugee flows function as an economic transmission mechanism, how one country's war becomes another country's fiscal emergency, and why the costs on both sides compound long after the fighting stops. Displacement is not a humanitarian event, it is an economic event with a balance sheet. The scale of the flow. The economics of refugee displacement begin with a single number: how many people move and how fast. According to UNHCR data, the Syrian conflict generated approximately 6.7 million refugees between 2011 and 2020, the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. These people did not simply disappear from one economy and reappear in another as neutral units. They carried costs in both directions. They left economic voids in Syria. They created economic demands in host countries. The flow itself, the movement, the transit, the temporary housing along migration routes, generated its own layer of expenditure. The International Organization for Migration estimated that the total cost of managing migration routes between Syria and Europe between 2015 and 2018 exceeded $3 billion. This figure covers border processing, temporary shelters along transit corridors, and emergency logistics. It does not cover the long-term integration costs that follow. It does not cover what Syria lost. The host country bill. When a refugee enters a host country, the economic clock starts immediately. Housing, food, healthcare, language instruction, legal processing, each of these generates expenditure from day one. The World Bank has documented per capita refugee hosting costs across European nations. In Germany, the average annual cost per refugee in the first year of arrival ran between $10,000 and $15,000, covering reception centers, initial health care, and administrative processing. Over a 5-year horizon, including integration programs, language courses, and access to social services, the cumulative per capita cost reached $25,000 to $40,000. Multiply that by 1.8 million Syrian refugees registered in Germany as of 2020. The total falls between $45 billion and $72 billion in cumulative hosting and integration expenditure over the integration period. Germany's annual defense budget during the same period averaged approximately $40 billion. The refugee crisis cost, on a cumulative basis, exceeded the country's annual defense spending. They said refugee integration would largely pay for itself within 3 to 5 years through labor market participation and economic contribution. They got integration timelines extending to 7 to 10 years on average, with full labor market participation rates among Syrian refugees in Germany reaching only 20% to 30% by 2020, according to the Institute for Employment Research in Nuremberg. The host country bill does not end with direct spending. Refugee inflows put pressure on housing markets, public transport, and school capacity in receiving regions. The OECD estimated that in cities hosting large refugee populations, rental costs increased by 2% to 5% annually, a cost borne by existing residents, not tracked in official refugee budgets. The origin country hemorrhage. Every refugee who leaves is a worker, a taxpayer, a consumer, and often a skilled professional who disappears from the origin country's economic base. This is the brain drain dimension of conflict displacement, and it is almost never discussed in the same conversation as refugee costs. According to World Bank estimates, Syria's working-age population declined by approximately 25% between 2011 and 2018 due to a combination of deaths, displacement, and emigration. This was not a uniform decline. It was concentrated among educated, mobile, and younger populations, precisely the demographic that drives productivity growth. Engineers, doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs, gone. The economic cost of losing 25% of a working-age population is not linear, it compounds. Each skilled worker who leaves reduces the capacity to train the next generation of workers. Each doctor who emigrates reduces healthcare access, which reduces workforce health, which reduces productivity. The IMF's framework for measuring human capital loss in conflict-affected states estimates that each percentage point decline in the skilled workforce reduces long-term GDP potential by 0.4 to 0.7 percentage points annually. For Syria, the cumulative effect of this outflow on potential GDP growth extends across decades. They said displacement was temporary. Most refugees would return within 2 to 3 years when conditions stabilized. They got return rates below 15% as of 2023, according to UNHCR tracking data. The economic infrastructure required to absorb returning populations, jobs, housing, services, had itself been destroyed. The brain drain became permanent. The remittance disruption. Before displacement, many Syrian workers sent money home. Remittances, transfers from diaspora workers to families in the origin country, function as a critical economic lifeline in conflict-affected regions. The World Bank estimated that pre-conflict remittance flows into Syria ran between $1.5 billion and $2 billion annually. Conflict disrupted these flows in both directions. Banking systems in Syria collapsed. Transfer networks became unreliable. Families separated across borders lost access to the financial mechanisms that had sustained them. Post-displacement, remittance patterns shifted, but the total volume directed back to Syria declined sharply as newly arrived refugees in host countries were themselves in economic survival mode, earning subsistence-level income or receiving welfare transfers rather than generating surplus for remittance. This disruption removed a financial stabilizer from Syria's economy at precisely the moment it was most needed. The gap was partially filled by humanitarian aid, but aid flows are irregular, politically contingent, and carry administrative overhead that remittances do not. The transit country tax. Between the origin and the final host country, refugees pass through transit nations: Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Greece, North Macedonia, Hungary. Each of these countries absorbs a portion of the flow, either temporarily or permanently, and each bears costs that international compensation mechanisms cover only partially. Turkey hosts approximately 3.6 million Syrian refugees, the largest refugee population of any single country. The Turkish government estimates total hosting costs at over $40 billion since 2011, according to figures cited by UNHCR and the Turkish Presidency of Disaster and Emergency Management. The European Union committed $6 billion to Turkey through the EU Facility for Refugees in Turkey between 2016 and 2021, covering roughly 15% of Turkey's stated costs. The remaining 85% was absorbed by Turkish taxpayers and redirected from domestic budgets. Jordan and Lebanon present similar patterns at smaller scale. Lebanon, with a pre-crisis population of approximately 4.5 million, absorbed over 1 million Syrian refugees, a per capita refugee burden higher than any other country in the world. The World Bank estimated that refugee hosting reduced Lebanon's GDP growth rate by 1.2 to 1.5 percentage points annually during peak inflow years. They said, international burden-sharing mechanisms would distribute the cost of displacement equitably across host nations. They got a system where frontline and transit countries bore 70% to 85% of total costs, with compensation arriving slowly, partially, and with conditions attached. The integration failure cost. Integration is not a one-time event. It is a process that, when it fails, generates its own layer of economic costs, paid by both the refugee population and the host country. When refugees do not successfully integrate into the host country's labor market, they become a permanent fiscal liability rather than a transitional one. The cost of long-term welfare dependency, housing subsidies, unemployment benefits, healthcare access, and social services runs between $8,000 and $12,000 per person annually in Western European systems, according to OECD benchmarking data. For a refugee population of 1.8 million in Germany, even a 50% failure rate in labor market integration generates a permanent annual cost of $7 billion to $11 billion indefinitely. The causes of integration failure are themselves measurable. Language acquisition timelines for Arabic speakers in German language environments average 3 to 5 years to functional proficiency, according to research from the Max Planck Institute. Credential recognition barriers prevent qualified professionals from practicing in their field. Cultural and social network gaps slow employment access. Each of these barriers has a calculable cost in delayed labor market entry, and each day of delay extends the duration of fiscal dependency. The long account. Refugee economics is not a short-term problem. It is a structural realignment of economic activity across multiple countries, operating on a timeline measured in decades. The origin country loses workforce, skills, and demographic momentum. The transit countries absorb uncompensated fiscal pressure. The final host countries redirect domestic budgets toward integration at a scale that competes with defense and infrastructure spending. And the refugees themselves, the population at the center of this system, face integration timelines that exceed the optimistic projections by a factor of 2 to 3. No single actor in this system operates at a profit. No single actor bears costs in proportion to the decisions that created the crisis. The conflict originates in one place. The fiscal consequences distribute across a dozen countries. The bill arrives years after the headlines disappear. Germany spent $20 billion. Turkey spent $40 billion. Syria lost 25% of its workforce permanently. And the total cost of this single refugee crisis, across all host countries, transit nations, and origin country losses, is estimated by the World Bank at between $150 billion and $200 billion over a 10-year horizon. This is not a humanitarian crisis with economic side effects. It is an economic crisis disguised as a humanitarian one. The displacement is real, the suffering is real. But the mechanism, the system through which one country's war becomes every other country's budget problem, is calculable, measurable, permanent. Subscribe to the price of conflict, because the cost of war does not stay where the war is fought.